So background to this paper. First, in 2018, I published a paper in PPR called Infinite Value and the Best of All Possible Worlds. And the impetus for that paper was reading papers that were advancing a particular form of the argument from evil, which I call the argument from surpassability. That argument goes like this. If God exists, he would only create a world that is unsurpassable. That is a world such that there's no other better world he could have created instead. But premise two, our world is surpassable. There are better worlds God could have created instead, and therefore, conclusion, God does not exist. Okay, and I challenge premise two of this argument, which is not the usual one people challenge, but like Leibniz, I think this premise is false. But unlike Leibniz, I don't think it's false because our world is the uniquely best. I think that it's just one of many incomparable worlds that are unsurpassable. But what I noticed in the literature advancing this argument and the related literature advancing the argument that there's no best world is that these tended to kind of give very simplistic arguments like, oh, any world could be improved because you can just add another happy person to it. Okay, well, that makes sense if the world has only a finite number of people in it, but what if the world has an infinite number of people in it? Then this gets at least a little bit more complex. So that's the kind of issue that I explored in that 2018 paper. And then Daniel Rubio wrote a reply in 2020 in AJP in defense of No Best World. It's a very good paper, and it changed my thinking on these topics a little bit. And this essay in this edited volume that you read is going off of that exchange and trying to advance the discussion. And the one main thing that Rubio did in his paper that clarified my thinking, he gave what I think is the best method, formal method out there for comparing infinitely valuable worlds. That is, worlds that have, for example, an infinite number of people in them, or people whose lives go infinitely well, for example, because they exist forever in heaven or something. So that you have a total, in total, you have an infinite amount of value in the world. And it's very hard to figure out how do you compare these things, but Daniel offers a very nice formal way of doing that. And I noticed as I was reviewing the paper before this talk that they mangled that equation in the publisher mangled the equation. It was not in the original proofs I got. It was not mangled, and so I must not have checked the final version, or maybe they didn't send the final version to me. I'm not sure, which is part of why I wanted to share what I have here. Let me see. Oh, I can flip the camera around. Great. Okay, so this is going to be super low tech here. I was hoping to copy this into the chat. Maybe I'll try to do that later. Okay, let's see. That's the argument from surpassability. Okay, you see that? Maybe you could take a screenshot. You can take a screenshot and paste that. Okay, that is what the equation is supposed to look like. So I'll read it out here. It says that world Wj is at least as good as world Wk if and only if the sum of so the summation over W, it's still a complicated equation, over W sub j sub n, that is each location, each locus of value in world Wj, so like say persons or loci of value, so like the sum of each person's lives. So we start with person one, and then the next part we subtract person one in world Wk, the value of their life there. And then we sum over one, person two, person three, and so on. So we take the sum of those differences. If the sum of those differences is greater than zero, or at least as great as zero, then Wj is at least as good as Wk. And one aspect of this, there are two aspects of this that are innovative. One is that it doesn't require that we assign any absolute value to either world. So it could be that there's just no way to do that in a principal way, that like the values, that the sum diverges or something, but we can still assign a comparative value. We can still compare two worlds where we can't say, oh, here's the absolute value of each world. That's one thing. The other is that if there are locations, like people's lives, for example, that exist in one world but not the other, we fill in the missing location in the other world with a zero. And then that lets us, those two things lets us do quite a lot of comparison. And so then I have this example in the paper, which is table 10.1. If any of you have the paper pulled up there, comparing two worlds that both contain lives, the others does not. So we have Nevin, Daniel, Graham, and Justin. And in W1, we just have Nevin and Justin. In W2, we have Daniel, Graham, and Justin. So W2 lacks me, unfortunately. W1 lacks Daniel and Graham. But we write zeros on those lines. And everybody has a value of 10 in their life. And then because W2 has 2 more lives than W1, it has Daniel and Graham, but it only lacks Nevin. And then there's an infinite number of other people not on the table. So even though there's an infinite number of people, we can say that the difference between these W2 ends up 10 better. So we sum the differences, which is the bottom line of the table. So that's the basic idea of Rubio's procedure. Does that make sense before I go on? Okay. So that's the new procedure, which I like. But even with this procedure, I claim that there's still plausibly quite a bit of incomparability. So what I said in my 2018 paper was that there's no good reason to think that premise 2 of the argument of surpassability is true. That is, that our world can be surpassed. And I considered 2 ways that the world could be surpassed. One is by adding more good things. So in Rubio's new procedure, you're like adding new lines on that table, for example. You're adding more loci of value, more persons, for instance. And the other is by improving existing things, by making, for example, people's lives better. I still think those are the only 2 ways you can improve the world with Rubio's new way of comparing things. But Rubio's persuaded me that it's maybe a little bit more plausible that premise 2 is true. I think now what I think is that it depends on your substantive metaphysical and ethical commitments. And what I do in this paper is I go through some metaphysical views that I think make it possible or impossible to improve the world by adding more people, assuming people are the loci of value for the sake of argument. And roughly, I think it depends on the metaphysics of what makes an individual the individual it is. So, for example, whether or not you believe in pre-existent hexaeities. I think hexaeistic views tend to make this premise false. Non-hexaeistic views tend to make it true. That's what I think now. And I consider some ethical views that I think make a difference to whether it's possible to improve the world by improving people's lives. And this is closer to familiar problem of evil territory. So roughly, I think that if you're an additive hedonist, you think that what determines the overall value in a world or of a world is just how much pleasurable experiences people have. If that's your view, then yes, I think it is possible to improve the world. But I think that on more capacious value theories, which I myself think are more plausible, that it's not possible. So that's the basic outline of the paper. And then I go into the details of arguing for the why implications of the different metaphysical and ethical views in the paper. So happy to talk about that now.
Lovely. That was really helpful, Nevin. So thank you for that summary. I think we all benefited from that immensely. In addition to Nevin's wonderful summary, I also included, it took me a little bit of technical maneuvering to do it, but what I think is the correct equation in the chat. I had to do some, whatever. But yeah, if anybody has a question and you're new to Microsoft Teams, there's a raise hand function right next to the people button at the top, and then you can just kind of hit that. I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is I'm going to go to Eric first because I know Eric always has a question. I'm going to go to Steve first. But I'm going to go to Eric first for a question because I imagine that he has one.
Yeah, let me just find the relevant page because I've gotten these out of order when I was looking at the yeah, so your procedure for trying to show that if there's an indefinitely extensible number of hastities, God could instantiate them.
Yes.
I wasn't totally convinced by this, I'm afraid. My worry is that it doesn't matter if God creates these things at different logical moments or different moments in time. It seems to me we should be able to, what we would end up with is at the 0th level of the hierarchy of our impure set theory, would have an indefinitely extensible number of things. We'd have as many things in the 0th level as we do sets in total. That seemed to me the crux the problem here. But at the first level of the hierarchy, you get the set of things at the 0th level. So you'd have a set as large as the set of all sets, and you get a contradiction. So yeah, I mean, maybe I've missed something about. Essentially, my worry is the initial worry with having God instantiate all of these Hacetes was not how he does it, but that he does it would lead to contradiction. And what and maybe I just missed something here, but I couldn't see what in the response addressed that worry, that you just can't have an impure set theory with that many things, with that many elements.
Yeah, thanks. So let me give two responses, and you can tell me what you think of them. So the first response is, so you say that at the 0th level that you have this absolutely many, or excuse me, absolutely infinitely many things, and that's going to lead to contradictions. So I think my question is 0th level when? And what I want to deny is that it's coherent or that it makes sense to take the collection of all of the things in the world as a whole, because I think there's no fact of the matter as to what the world as a whole is. Because on the kind of picture I've given here, there's no algorithm that God is using to create. And so it's not like you can say, oh, here's exactly what's going to happen in the future. And so then we can say, all right, here's what happens over the whole of logical time. Rather, my thought is that I think it actually is necessarily the case that if God creates absolutely infinitely many things, or to maybe put it in a different way, that there's like no, that he always keeps creating in this way, that he's always creating a larger cardinal number of people at any moment, that he's going to be doing it in a way that that can't be algorithmized, so that it is free in some sense. And so given that, I think you can say, well, up until now, there's like the set of things that have been created up until now, a set of things that have been created up until any given moment, but there's no set of things or collection of things that have been created in totality across the whole of logical time. And so I think there's just no like collection of things that like there is no collection of things that then you would worry, oh, that can't be put into a set. So that's reply one. And then reply two, and I'm curious what you think of this, is that like let's suppose that I'm wrong about this and that there is a contradiction. Well, I think that if there is a problem here, that it's also going to affect the view that there are absolutely infinitely many hexaedes to begin with, because you can just run the paradox where the set is not like concrete things, but it's the set of abstract hexaedes. And in that case, then this argument, if it works, it's just a reductio of the view that there are absolutely infinitely many hexaedes. So there have to be only kappa many hexaedes for some cardinal number kappa. And in that case, then there's no problem with God creating all of them. So those are my two replies.
Yeah, so I want to leave the second reply aside for now, and just focus on whether the picture you gave of what God creating indefinitely many things might look like, because I think that's independently of interest. So I think I must not quite understand your when point. If God makes all of these people, they must be made at some point. And so that's got to be that I'm not quite sure what the notion of God doing things in logical time is. I can understand that there might be dependence relations between the things that he does, but I'm not quite sure I understand the time aspect of that. But even just looking at the people who are made, they've got to be made at times if they're spatiotemporal beings. And I don't see why I can't just quantify not over all the objects that exist at some time, but just all the objects that exist at any time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then it wouldn't matter if there's this logical dependence between the order or the dependence in how God creates all of these people. The fact that they are created would be enough for me to group them all together. Yeah, and then I'd have to put them into a set if they're element. Well, I mean, maybe you think there's only a class of hasties rather than a set of hasties.
Right.
And I also worry about the point that there's no algorithm. My worry here is that although the question of whether we could predict um uh why what's the issue with once God has done it, and it might take him an infinite amount of logical time to do that or something, but once he's done it, kind of retrodicting what he did, he must have done something, is sort of the idea. And whatever thing he did, I can at least specify what that thing was. I might not be able to specify a decision procedure or something like that. Um, but so yeah, I'm worried that, setting aside the logical dependence and logical time stuff, if God makes the things and he makes them in a world, then it looks like I should be able to quantify over them, because it looks like I should be able to quantify, and not even unrestricted quantification. I'm restricting my quantification to the set of people. If it makes sense to talk about all people, it looks to me like I can get all the people together in a set, right? And if
Yeah.
there's a
Right.
hasty
Right.
or if there's a hasty for each person, of course the hasty might have applied to something other than a person at some point. But if there's hasty for each person, then it looks like I should be able to get as many things in a set as there are hasties. Yeah.
Yeah, good. So I think there are 3 points there, and I'm going to reply to them in what I think is reverse order. So first, you asked like, well, why can't we just like retrodict and describe what God has done? Well, I think the problem there is that this is a never-ending process, and so it's not just that like there's a dense infinite space or something, like an infinite number of times that God progresses through or something, but that it's a never-ending process. That it's there's no endpoint, and so I don't think that you can like get to the end of it and then look back. So that's the response to that point. And then with the like, well, why can't you just like quantify over all the times and say, well, the things that are created at each time, why can't you do something like that? And I think the problem there is that I think it's there's no fact of the matter as to what God does at future times. And so it's a kind of open future view, but for God's actions at different logical moments. Where to be a little bit simplistic, like if we let's just for simplicity's sake suppose that within a universe like eternalism's true, so that what happens is fixed, but that like God creates an uncountably infinite number of universes, excuse me, an absolutely infinite number of universes, and does so at each logical does creates some at each logical moment. Well, then my thought is that like the universes that have been created so far, like including ours, up to the logical moment at which ours was created, that's there's a set of those, but then God keeps on creating, and there's no fact of the matter as to what universes God creates, how many God creates at a particular future times, and so on, because that logical future is open. But on standard views of the open future, like within our universe, just like ordinary libertarian free will views that embrace an open future, that they would say, well, there's no set of like things that we'll do, for example, because there's no fact of the matter of like whether who will win the sea battle tomorrow or whatever. And so it's a similar kind of view here. So there's going to be no set of all possible people because there's no fact of the matter as to who the possible people are. Excuse me, no set of all actual people, because there's no fact of the matter as to who the actual people are, because God hasn't created them all yet, and it's open who He creates. So that's the second thing, and then the third thing, which I think is a good place to be pressing me on. You say like, well, like if we can say something like God creates all possible people, then why can't we quantify over all the people? And it is tricky for me to like state the view in a way that I don't commit myself to the thing that I'm trying to deny. So I'm not entirely sure if I did this properly in the paper, but just to say something like there is like frame it as a negation or something, like it's not the case that there's some that God creates some set of people that there's a larger set out there that He could have created instead. And then I kind of describe, well, here's what God is doing. He's acting in this free way where there's no algorithm, and He creates like a larger cardinal number of universes at each moment. And he does that in such a way that there's like no limit to that process, and I think I can say those kinds of things. And then, I can say like in quotation marks. And so he creates absolutely infinitely many people. Okay, well, we can't actually say that, but that's the kind of thing that if there was an endpoint, that we would be getting towards. So I think what I would try to do is to try to rephrase my position in a way that I'm not using that language. And then say, okay, so I'm not quantifying over all of the hexaides. And so then that's consistent with me saying you can't do it. You can't quantify over all of the actual people.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed that exchange. Next, we'll go to Steve.
So as always, Nevin, really enjoying your work and your thoughts. So I'm worried about some of the implications of your view. So I worry that, look, if God maxes out the amount of intrinsic value that's possible, then he has no reason to create. He has no reason not to create, but he has no reason either way. And so then it's kind of mysterious as to why he creates. Certainly, he's not praiseworthy for doing so. On the other hand,
Interrupt to say, so you what by that you mean that if God is like maximally valuable already by himself,
yeah,
right? That's
yeah, that's right. So creating external world doesn't add value to it. Now imagine the opposite is not true, that God does not by himself max out the value. Well, then we'd ask, is there a unique maximum or not? If there's not a unique maximum, either because there's an infinite sequence or because there's a number of ties, then it seems it's arbitrary. And then we have kind of Klaus's objections. Klaus might not agree with, but they're the Klaus objection nonetheless, which is that's entirely arbitrary as to how God chooses it. There's nothing about God. God's independence doesn't allow that. But imagine you thought, well, instead that the world does add value to that he creates adds value to God, and that there's a unique maximum world that he can create. Well, then it looks like he's not responsible because he's locked in virtue of his essential nature to create that world. So it seems we have three options here. Either he has no reason to create, or he does have a reason to create, and the reason to create either not set as responsibility or makes him act in an arbitrary manner.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I got it. So, for the purposes of this paper, at least, a lot of this is dialectical. I don't have firm views here. Like, I maybe I would be okay with God maxing out intrinsic value on his own, but at least for the purposes of this paper, I'm assuming with the proponents of the argument that I'm critiquing that God doesn't max out intrinsic value, that you can add that a universe with, that a world with God and a lot of people whose lives go well for them is better. A world with just God. So I'm assuming that. So I'm taking the horn of your dilemma where God doesn't max out on it. And then you give it the second dilemma on there. And so you'd said, well, if there is a maximum, like a best possible world with God plus something, then God is not responsible. If there are multiple unsurpassable worlds, then it's arbitrary which one God creates. And I'm taking that second horn. I'm saying that there are multiple unsurpassable worlds. And so I guess it's arbitrary. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about why you think it sounded like you think that's inconsistent with the divine character in some worrying way.
I do. I think it violates his independence. If it's arbitrary, then he's going to act on either a brute preference or a random number generator. And to steal Klaus, you need you need a brute preference to pick which random number generator. And if you think independence is required for two reasons, one, you might think it's assumed by the modal ontological argument, which I do, or two, you might think that the greatest possible being, there can't be like multiple ways to exemplify it. Otherwise, you have fundamental arbitrariness in what explains the universe. So I tend to think that that's not open to the theist to say it's arbitrary which world he creates, because it sacrifices independence, and the cost for that is too high for the theist.
Right. Thanks. Okay. So I think the two things I would say. So, greatest possible being, there can't be multiple ways to exemplify it. I would say it depends on what you mean. I would say that there can only be one like way, because I don't think that. So I think there is a distinction here, and that like there are multiple unsurpassable worlds. I don't think there are multiple unsurpassable beings. I think there is like one greatest possible being, and it's God. So I think that there are not multiple ways to instantiate like God's essential characteristics. or the greatest possible being's essential characteristics. There's like a unique set of greatest possible essential characteristics. But I think that's compatible with that being God, then making some free choices that could go one way, could go another. So if you're like if you're taking that being to be, if you're thinking of that being in the sense of like that being's essential characteristics and all of the things that it does, then yeah, you could have different such beings in that sense. But that would be like if I had assume I had libertarian free will, if I had lived my life differently, then I think I would still be the same person. It's not like there's, Nevin 1 and Nevin 2, and they're like actually distinct persons. No, there's just Nevin making different choices in World 1 and World 2. And so there's the same God making different choices in World 1 and World 2. And I'll say the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll let you respond. And so then you worry, well, this violates God's independence. If God is he's like acting on the basis of something outside of him. I think, I don't know if I have I certainly don't think I have a response here that'll satisfy you. But one thing I could say here is that I think this is just an instance of a kind of general worry for libertarianism. And so it's at least not a new problem if we're theists and we are libertarians about free will, which is at least common among theists. And so I think it's just an instance of that same problem. And if you're okay with saying, okay, maybe there's something a little bit mysterious here, but we think that there can be like agent causation with libertarian free will where we act for reasons, but there's no like determination of which reasons we act for. It's just the same thing with God. So it's at least not it's at least not a new problem. That's the other thing I would say.
Sure, I really like the response. I think it's a powerful one, but I'm a little bit lost as to how. I mean, imagine multiple sort of set collections of properties, and they have different group preferences as to which world to create. And we say, okay, well, which one turns out to be God? One thing someone could say is, there's no explanation. One that randomly gets exemplified. Okay, well, that's not going to work, right? Because that's random. Someone could say, well, no, but really, this is the same problem as free action. So your demand of group preference is just the contrastive explanation criticism of libertarian free will. But I deny that. For number one, it's unclear to me how you can make a free decision without some sort of preference or desire or something about your psychology which explains why you decided in the way in which you did. It can't be just there's nothing about God that connects up with this decision. I mean, a divine libertarian can't and shouldn't say that. But second, look, I don't see why this gets around the problem. If we say, well, why did God make this free decision rather than that free decision? And someone says, well, he just did. Look, even if this does work for human beings, it's a bizarre view of an independent being that he just made this decision and nothing more can be said about it. So two then, sure. One is I don't think we can escape the problem of independence conflicting with the group preference. And two, even if we can, I just think it relocates the problem elsewhere. The problem of group preferences then just relocates the problem of a free and completely unexplained decision. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So on the first thing, is there an explanation for why God chooses the way he does? Well, I would say it depends on exactly what you're looking for. You can explain, you can give some reasons why God created this world, or why I guess I should put it that way, well, it depends on which model we go, and I'm neutral. But if we go on the way I was just on my earlier exchange with Eric, where God continues creating, then why he is creating in this way. Okay. Well, you can point to the good things that are in this world, and you can say, well, look, God wants those things. Okay, so that's some kind of an explanation. Now, if you want, well, why did God create this rather than this other unsurpassable world? Well, no, you can't answer that question, or you can't give an answer that fully explains it. Which does strike me as similar to the problem with libertarian free will. And I think I'm sympathetic to some kind of principle of sufficient reason, but I don't think it should be such a strong one that everything has a necessitating explanation. And so I would just say this is one of those instances where you don't have that. I think that's okay. Now, you did say, and I thought this is interesting, that maybe there's a special problem with God, that with us, it's okay if we have libertarian free will, where there is some kind of arbitrariness. But for a perfect being, you might think that this is especially problematic. I can kind of get my head around that intuition. I can see why you might think that. So that's not. I think that's a plausible suggestion. And I guess I would just say it's, that might be right, might be wrong. And I think it's a bullet I'm willing to bite or accept a little bit of unintuitiveness, because I think that there's enough, this account is fruitful enough in other ways, that, then maybe on reflection, we want to give up that principle about God.
All right, awesome. Next, we'll go to Klaus.
I'm really enjoying the discussion, Nevin, and even more the exchange that you've been having with Daniel over the last few years on this. This is really, really first-rate stuff. So it's a real joy to watch it unfold. I had, I think, similar worries to Eric, so I hope I'm not re-asking the same question. But in response to the Rubio worry about absolute infinities, I didn't quite understand why you grant. This is sort of bottom of 221, why you're willing to grant that in a single moment, God couldn't create absolutely infinitely many people, but that it somehow works if God does it over logical moments of time by creating ever larger cardinalities of hexaides. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is, do you need absolute infinitely many of those moments in time? But then I'm not really clear on how you get to the absolute infinite cardinality by building up regular cardinalities. You can't sort of get there even in this many logical moments. That's part of it. Then the other thing was, I thought you said in response to Eric something about the open future, but I didn't really see how that was supposed to work when we're talking about logical moments here. So maybe you can help me understand what's going on here, because I think I've missed something.
What I said there is that I'm granting that God cannot create absolutely infinitely many people in either a single moment or in a finite number of moments. So that there's, like, if we're like looking forward into the logical future, there's like no moment at which we can say, oh, okay, now God has created absolutely infinitely many people. And the reason I'm granting that is because I'm granting that the reductio that Daniel's giving of the possibility of there being absolutely infinitely many things is sound. So there can't be like some time at which we can say, okay, there are absolutely infinitely many things. So I'm assuming that's the case. So that means that this is something God can't do, is to create in that way. But then I say, here's something God could do instead. He could just keep creating and create more at each moment. And I'm not imagining, it's a good question, I'm not imagining absolutely infinitely many moments. I'm imagining just countably many infinite moments, countably infinitely many moments. So just imagine like the number line. There's moment 1, moment 2, moment 3, and so on. But that never ends. So just.
But then you never. But then you never get to the absolutely infinitely many hexaides, which is the scenario at issue, right? God's got to make all the absolutely infinitely many hexaides.
If God only made the same cardinal number of hexaides at each moment. But well, okay, two things. So suppose that God only made aleph null hexaides at each moment. Okay. Well, then you would only, I think I have this right. You would only get aleph null hexaides in total. You would certainly only have a cardinal number of hexaides in total. And if you take any cardinal number, and if God makes that cardinal number at each moment, you're only going to get a cardinal number in total. Okay. And in general, here's something even more general. This connects to what my reply to Eric. If there's some algorithm that we can describe where, like right now, God creates aleph null. At the next moment, he creates aleph 1. At the next, aleph 2, and so on. Well, the limit of that is also going to be a cardinal number. And so there's going to be like a set of all of the things that God creates in that scenario as well. But I think God is free. God is not bound to create in a way that can be described by an algorithm. It's not like God has to follow this procedure that says, oh, I'm going to like increase, aleph null, aleph 1, or I'm going to like, take the power set or, whatever at each moment. He can always like do something. He can like decide at each moment, okay, I'm going to do something different now that's going to increase it more than, would have been possible by some algorithm. And so then now we can't say, at least if I'm being careful, I don't want to say, okay, God creates absolutely infinitely many people in total. But we can say that there's like no other world in which God creates more people. That there's no like other process that leads to more people being created than the one that I'm describing, where God where God creates a larger number at each moment, but not in a way that can be described by an algorithm.
I do want to follow up about the algorithm later on because I had a worry there too. But
Yeah.
I guess so I guess what I was hung up on is that the scenario at issue seemed to require that God create all of the absolutely infinitely many hexaides. But in fact, it turns out you want to resist that. You just want to say nobody, including God, could do more.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's very helpful.
It might be that it might be that I described it a little uncarefully at a few points, but yeah, I think that if I compare it, it's the way I should put it.
Okay, or more likely that I read it carelessly, but yeah, thanks. That's super helpful. And that obviously would suffice for your purposes, right? Okay.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to exercise some moderator privileges and attempt to ask a question, which is just like a follow-up on something that you said while you were talking with Steve. So you said you don't think that it's possible that there could be multiple greatest possible beings, right? So like a GPB or something like this. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering what you then make of Nagasawa's 2017 book, right? So in Nagasawa 2017, he's like, well, you could have these sort of like unique cocktails of fitting the traits together. And really what God is the maximally like, consistent set of divine making attributes or like great making attributes. But as some people have pointed out, right, well, it could be the case that maybe there's like some kind of ceiling to this, right? But there are multiple ways to hit that ceiling. So you get like
Right.
60%, I'm making up percentages, but like 60% omnipotence, 40% benevolence, or 60% benevolence and 40%. So I'm wondering, just because you mentioned that and you're here, is this a tacit rejection of Nagasawa's maximal God approach, or do you sympathize with his approach, but for different reasons? So yeah, I just want to ask you about that.
Yeah, thanks. So I haven't read Nagasawa's book. So you have me at a disadvantage here. I'm vaguely aware of some of the discussion, but this isn't an area that I've done a lot of research in. And so, I'm kind of reporting my inclinations, but I think you're bringing out a good worry that I don't have a whole lot to say about. I guess maybe the main thing to say is it strikes me as more why I said what I did. It strikes me as more troubling to say that there are like multiple um, equally good unsurpassable beings or incomparable unsurpassable beings than to say that there are multiple incomparable unsurpassable worlds. Because in the latter case, yeah, you have Steve's worries about like, well, there's arbitrariness in how God creates, but that troubles me a little bit less for the kinds of reasons that I gave. Whereas if you could have like multiple like incomparable unsurpassable beings or equally good unsurpassable beings, I mean, for simplicity, suppose there are 10 of them, 10 such possible beings, then it does look very mysterious to me why you would have like one rather than the other. Partly because it looks to me like that kind of being would have to exist necessarily, and with like a contingent fact, like what world is actualized. I'm comfortable with unexplained brute facts there, but necessary facts, like no, that should have an explanation. Like if it's necessary that God exists, right, then that shouldn't be something where like, oh, it was just number three, right? No, that's not. That doesn't seem right. So I think there does need to be some kind of explanation. So that's why I said what I did. But I don't have anything I think particularly helpful to say on that worry because I haven't read too much into it.
Okay. Just one follow-up there. You said that necessary facts you think require some kind of explanation. So Oppie is now my supervisor, so I'm going to ask an Oppie-esque question.
Okay.
So I think Oppie's view is something like, well, look, when I say that something's necessary, that's where the explanation bottoms out. I mean, when I put the box in front of it, it just couldn't have been in any other way. So why think that necessary things require an explanation? And I'm kind of curious why you think that, because it's kind of not a niche view. I don't want to say it's a niche view, but I know that Oppie disagrees with it quite considerably. So I'm wondering what the motivation for thinking that is. Because a lot of people are going to say, well, 1 + 1 = 2. And that's just like, there's just certain things that are necessarily true. And I don't need to provide an explanation for it. And the reason is because they're necessary and they couldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah. So maybe I should, I think I want to draw a distinction and then maybe I should be a little bit more careful in stating my view about necessary things. So first, we should distinguish so suppose P is a necessary fact. Distinguish explaining P from explaining necessarily P, right? And I do think that at least P needs an explanation. At least as I'm talking, this is the view that I'm committing myself to. Maybe I'll back off it. But at least P needs an explanation, and the explanation might be that P is necessary. But then, why is P necessary? Why is it that necessarily P? And there, I think that at least in most cases, there should be a further explanation, because like the space of necessity is quite complicated. There's like mathematics, for example, there's all of these facts, and some of them are axiomatic or basic, but then there's this very substantial superstructure. And so that superstructure, at least, you can explain by appeal to the foundations. Now, maybe there are foundations that are unexplained, or where, like necessarily, and then you have certain axioms, and maybe those are explained by like a, like some kind of logical necessity. I'm not sure, but I probably wouldn't say that in all cases. But at any case, I'm okay with there being like some axioms, some foundations like that. But say like 2 + 3 = 5. That's not going to be one of those. You're going to be able to explain that in terms of like axioms, and then derive that. And similarly, like this being, these 10 is the necessary one. That doesn't look to me like the kind of thing that is going to be in those necessary foundations. I think it's going to be something that's much simpler than that. So it doesn't look to me like a plausible candidate to put in the unexplained necessary facts. So that's the other thing I would say.
Okay, good. There's a follow-up I have about universe creation, but I'm going to go through the other questions, and then I'll cycle back to my point. So we're going to go to Steve.
I think Eric couldn't raise his hand, but he tried to.
So I just want to clarify what your ultimate attitude is towards Rubio's procedure for comparing worlds. So the basic motivation is we don't compare worlds, we compare contents of worlds. And where we don't have the same contents of worlds, we make little surrogates, and then we can do our comparing. But then when you talk about improving lives, you seem to take issue with this, right? It seems like one of the key problems you've got with the worlds that's exactly the same, except I take a nap first, is that it's this like part by part comparison, and like this idea that if I've got a bad life that gets better as opposed to vice versa, look, I can pair them up, but one of them seems overall better. So even though you at the beginning seem to be saying that one of the nice things about Rubio's procedure is that it's got this comparative aspect to it, that seems to be what recommends it. And it's only because he's got that he's, or maybe I'm simplifying a bit too much here, but I was taking it that his objections to your initial argument depended on that procedure for comparing. But if you're right that like the ordering and things like that are important, and that you can't just do part-wise comparison, then it looks like his procedure doesn't work. And it looks to me like you don't actually have to complicate things, other than like some like maybe slightly misphrasing things initially. So it looks to me like surely we can, if your ultimate assessment is that his procedure doesn't work, then we can save ourselves a lot of time here, and stick with roughly the argument as you first had it, and just reject his way of comparing between worlds, and say the standard way of just assigning each world a value, and then just comparing them in the usual way. That's all we've got. And when we do that, unsurpassability seems quite plausible. So what is your ultimate position on Rubio's procedure? Because I wasn't quite clear on that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. So the first thing I would say, so I think I accept Rubio's procedure for the sake of argument. And so I do want to say here that I'm not like committing myself to saying this is the does let us compare worlds in this way, because there are worries you could raise about things like the repugnant conclusion and so on. And I'm kind of setting those aside and assuming, like, yeah, this is fine. You can, like, value is additive in a way that lets this work. So I'm assuming that for the sake of argument. But then the thing I would want to say to the part that you're pointing at in this section on improving people's lives is that I want to, while still granting for the sake of argument that Rubio's procedure does work for adding in the technical term in the literature, locations, these loci of value, what I want to deny is that experiences are locations. And I think that the example that I give suggests that this is compatible with people's lives being experiences. So, for example, yes, I want to say a life that goes from bad to good is better than one that goes to good to bad, even if the total value of the experiences in both lives is the same. But if you have, for simplicity, suppose they're causally disconnected. If you have people interacting, I think it's more complicated. But suppose that, like, God creates 10 people. Let's make it simpler. Three people, and their lives have values 0, 1, and 2. And in world 1, and they don't interact with each other. And in world 1, the 0 person is created first, and then the 1 person, then the 2 person. And in world 2, the 2 person, then the 1 person, then the 0 person. Those worlds don't look to me different in value. I think I'm happy to say those worlds are equally valuable. So my intuition is different in that case than in the case of a person's life, where I think this kind of trajectory makes a difference. And so I think that, the worries I'm raising are particularly for the suggestion that we can apply this procedure to experiences, but not that this procedure can be applied to, like, some loci of value, so that we don't have to like a radical kind of value holism where there's just, like, no kind of additive that we can do.
Yeah, I was worried that this might be pushing you towards a kind of value holism, and then you can't add up bits of the world. You got to look at the whole thing. That's helpful. So I think I was taking your objection to be kind of more formal and less intuition based than it was, and that's why I was thinking this should generalize beyond experiences to people. But I'm wondering if you've got something like the nap case going on here. So, in the nap case, there's the first experience, which is just a nap, and then it's just the same afterwards. But now compare, God starts making people, and he just makes progressively better people. One where their life is value 1, one where their life is value 2, and so on. And now compare another example where he makes a neutral person, and then he does the same thing. Is the intuition different in this case to the nap case? Because I think my intuition here is that it's the same.
It depends on how the people are individuated in the second case. Because I don't want the locations to be times. I think that leads to the same kind of problems. And so if it's that God is creating, like, Alice, Bob, Charles, etc., and then in world 1, and then in world 2, first God creates Xenophon, and then Alice, Bob, Charles, and so on, and they're the same Alice as in world 1. Then those two worlds look to me like they have the same value. Because it's got the same individuals with the same amount of value in each of their lives, and then it's got this additional individual with a neutral life. If, on the other hand, what you're imagining is that we have Alice being created at the first moment in both worlds, but in the second world, Alice's life is neutral, and in the first world it has value 1, and then same with Bob and so on. Well, it does look to me like the first world is better, because each person's life is better in the first world. And so the reason I want to give different judgments in those cases is because I think that locations are plausibly people's lives, that's a plausible candidate for locations. But I don't think it would be plausible to just take times to be a location, so that even if God creates different people in the two worlds at each time, that we can just compare the times and say, well, each time there's more value, and so that the sum is greater. Some for why I don't like times as locations in the other paper, in the 2018 paper.
Okay, good. I don't think it was. I think rather than times, you could use anything that's kind of formally analogous. So I think I could also use places, right?
Yeah, sure,
Uh,
sure, yeah. And I think I'd have the same worries.
Okay.
Okay. So
Question.
the point is, look, I'm just not sure why set theory applies here at all. I mean, we're talking about collections. Collections are different than sets. A power set of a collection is not like a better collection doesn't have more intrinsic value. So you might think, well, cardinality applies to numbers and not, as well as sets. If so, I just wonder if that's your view. Second, if you introduce surreal numbers, 10 plus infinity is greater than infinity. That's fine, but that seems to support the view that there's, an infinite sequence of better worlds. And then third, you might think, well, there's just no infinity, in which case, again, there seems to be an infinite sequence. So my suspicion is the application of set theory, which both you and Eric suggested this thing, strikes me as sort of not a good move. And then the application of cardinality independent of set theory strikes me as an interesting move, but I'm wondering if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, I don't think that's what I'm doing. That last thing. So you can tell me. I might still not be getting it, but you can tell me if this helps. So I don't see a problem with you're taking sets of people in assuming people are locations. You're taking sets of people in say two worlds, and then you're comparing the value of those people's lives across. You're comparing, doing this Rubius procedure of the sum of differences across each member of the set of each set. So one thing that I can say there, and this is something I do like about Rubius procedure, is that we don't have to say that either set has a value itself. We don't have to say anything like that. What we're doing is we're summing the difference between the values at each location. That is the values of each member of the set. And it doesn't look to me like there's anything philosophically problematic about saying like, oh, there's a certain value to each person's life, which are the members of each set. Does that help at all, or am I missing it?
So I like your point. I don't think it works for two reasons. Number one, I don't like Rubio's theory whatsoever. It's not comparative theory. It's non-comparative theory because, of course, you can't give someone a zero in a world in which they don't exist. You can't have an exemplification without an exemplifier. But number two, leaving that aside, which was not my objection. My objection is, let's say so Rubio says, well, why can't we have like a power set of the differences or something like that? And you might think, look, if the differences, why think that we can even apply cardinality amounts to the differences between two collections? You might think that cardinality is something that applies to sets, but there's nothing to do with sets. It has to deal with the well-being of collections of individuals. So, sets are just irrelevant here. And let me make the bold claim that, sets are in fact irrelevant here. And if so, I wonder if your sense of cardinality is operating independent of sets. And here's the argument for sets being irrelevant. Imagine again, you have three dinosaurs, each who have 10 utils, and you say, well, I want to take a power set of that. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but whatever it does, that doesn't produce more intrinsic value in the world to take a power set of those three dinosaurs.
Okay. So wait, so it sounded earlier when we're comparing two worlds, and we've got the differences. So we've got like line 1 is set 1, line 2 is set 2, and then line 3 is the difference between like subtracting first item in set 2 from the first item in set 1, and so on. That's set 3. Now, then with set 3, all we're doing is taking the sum of the members of set 3. So we're not.
I don't see why there's sets rather than collections.
I'm not sure if it makes a difference. What would be a problem if we took them to be collections?
Well, then the concern about power sets and things like that sort of drop from the wayside because then we just say, okay, we're comparing collections. But number two, if we're comparing collections, then the problem of exemplifier kicks in in a pretty solid manner, right? If you're comparing a world in which Eric exists to a world in which he doesn't, it's not the world in which he doesn't have zero well-being, has no well-being. There's nothing to exemplify a well-being level. And in fact, on the assumptions that you're making, which is welfare is true, intrinsic value depends on and only on well-being, and the simple model, well-being depends on and only on hedonism. It's just not the case that in a possible world in which Eric doesn't exist, he has zero well-being. He has no well-being, zero or otherwise. So what this suggests is if you are looking at collections, then you're not doing comparative theory. You're doing non-comparative theory, in which case we go straight to what the total is.
Yeah, I guess I take that aspect of, I'm still not sure if it's collections or sets, but I take that aspect of Rubio's procedure to just be like kind of a formal, to not have like substantive philosophical implications, and to just be kind of a formal aspect of the method where we have this placeholder 0, but it's not meant to say that like, oh, there is something that doesn't exist in that world that has 0 value. It's not meant to imply anything like that. It's just that if you could put like a hyphen instead, and then just say, well, here's what we do whenever there's a hyphen. We just insert the value from world 1 into the from the top line into the line 3 into the bottom line, or if it's hyphen in line 1, that we insert the negative of the value in line 2. You could say that instead, and then you get the same result. But so the 0 just kind of.
What problem with that is, I mean, if Eric has 5 units of utils in the real world and hyphen in possible world 2, the difference is not 5. The difference is no value whatsoever. It's neither positive, negative, nor neutral. So if that's how you want to treat it, it's not going to get any of the results we want, number one, and certainly not the intuitive results that you're trying to track. That's number one. But number two, formal procedures don't allow you to even make metaphysical errors. And if you're claiming that, not your claim, but if Rubio's claiming, or what your assumption here is that we can use formal procedures to get exemplification of exemplifiers, well, then your formal procedure is false because it relies on a metaphysical error.
I guess the last thing I'll say is, so yeah, Rubio's procedure doesn't strike me as implausible there. It seems to me more than it does to you that this is just kind of an innocuous formal method. But I guess that if I'm wrong about that, this is grist for my mill, because then there's even less comparability than I'm granting here. So I'm not wedded to Rubio's procedure, but I'm trying to show here's the response that we can give even if we grant this.
Yeah, let me try to press something like Steve's point, but maybe less skeptical about the general applicability of set theory. So have any kind of view of like the applicability of mathematics you like. So it's just moving symbols around, or like some kind of let's just grant that set theory applies. We might worry that there just aren't numbers of things that correspond to some of these larger sets. And I'm going to try to convince you that if you take a kind of Quinean position, then at most there should be as many as there are reals, but there's a strong argument that there's only as many as there are countable, as there are natural numbers. So if you think that a good guide to what exists is what the various sciences need, and we can take science to be broader than just physics here, right? Then it looks like in their applications, the highest that physics ever goes, and I don't think any of the other sciences go higher up the set theoretic hierarchy than physics does, the highest it goes is the reals, right? So that's reason to think that we needn't be committed to the possibility of more than real numbered things. In which case, you don't have to worry about like absolute infinities. Your response to Rubio about, he's saying, can't God just make more things? You might say, no, there's the reals, that's as high as it gets, right? You can, in set theory, of course, you can have more things, but like what can be instantiated in a spatiotemporal world, that just goes as high as the reals. That's just a limit of what something like space and time can do, and it's maybe a metaphysical limit. We may even think that we only require the naturals. So because science, when we make measurements, the measurements are always truncated. Actually, you don't, for like the empirical aspects, not the actual theoretical statement of the theory, but the actual application of it, you actually only need the rationals, and we've got as many rationals as we have naturals. Also, there are models of physics, even when it quantifies over the reals, where it's made true with a domain of countable size. You get
Right,
that from the downward
Yeah, yeah.
Lorenz-Skolan theorem. So yeah, maybe you've got a much easier route here. There are just limits to how many things there can be, and actually the ceiling's much lower than set theory would have us believe.
Yeah, good. So I'm perfectly open to those kinds of views, and I discussed them a little bit more in my original paper, where I make some similar kinds of suggestions, like, well, maybe something like this is true. So I mainly was giving this absolutely infinite response because I'm kind of granting, for the sake of argument, that there's not like some set of hexades that's the largest number that God could create. But if you have this kind of view where there like aren't even cardinal numbers that go above like the cardinality of the reals, for example, then then you should think that there aren't like a greater number of hexades, right? There's only as many hexades as there are real numbers, and then there's no problem God creating all of them, as you suggest. Yeah, so then I'm happy with that. I guess if I were to try to defend the view, or say like what might be nice about a view on which there are more numbers than that, at least in this context, like something specific to this discussion about theism, I think there's something kind of attractive about the Cantorian view that identifies or closely associates the absolute infinite with God, and so says that like you can't get to the absolute infinite through like an algorithm, for example, in the way I was describing, but that like God is what like transgresses all of that, and does like what you can't do by any other means. And it's hard to make precise, maybe necessarily so, but I think there's something interesting about that kind of view, and so I think it's kind of neat that my paper here ended up in a similar place. But I'm by no means wedded to that. So yeah, if we had a view like the one you were describing, where only the largest cardinality is the cardinality of the reals, yeah, I'm happy to make my argument there too. And as you say, it's easier to make.
So yeah, my suggestion was only, do you have an alternative and maybe simpler route to the conclusion you're already arguing for? I wasn't proposing this as a problem for anything you say. But I don't like the talk of absolute infinity. This is where Cantor drops the ball. I mean, I think we've managed to make some sense of what Cantor was trying to do there with the notion of indefinite extensibility, right? So, I mean, indefinite extensibility is it's still very difficult, but it seems we have some kind of handle on it. By Cantor's own standards, absolute infinity is just inconsistent. Whatever it is, it just it can't be a size because we've got the sizes already, and it's not one of them. So yeah, I worry that if we're trying to spell out some kind of connection between set theory and theology, absolute infinity is just not the way to do it because it's just hopelessly muddled. Whenever we try to, in any kind of reasonably precise way, spell out what we're meaning, we either say something contradictory or we go indefinite extensibility. There's no kind of route where you stay true to the kind of theological aspect of what Cantor was trying to say. And yeah, I admit this is somewhat a matter of taste. You kind of like this, and for me, this is everything yucky. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have more helpful to say on that specifically. I guess the one other thing I'll say on the kind of general question of why not go with this response is that this paper is very much about exploring logical space, and like, well, if we so I'm trying to take it a little for granted as possible and say like, okay, like let's assume, yeah, we've got this procedure that lets us compare worlds with infinities in them. Let's assume that you can have arbitrarily large cardinal numbers and so on. Well, what can we say then? And then I suggest it depends on your metaphysics of mixedities and so on. So really the kind of goal is that to say is to argue that at least in a lot of the ways that you end up going, that you end up with our world being unsurpassable. And you kind of articulated one way that like doesn't go quite as far as I did here in laying out the possibilities. That's another way that we could have unsurpassability. So yeah, that's kind of the broad project is to like map out logical space and say like, look, a lot of these ways you end up with the world being unsurpassable.
If I could ask a question just to exercise some moderate privileges, as if Steve, if that's okay. Okay. So I wonder about how you cash out the possible worlds. So I'm wondering if you think that, for instance, all possible worlds similar to API share an initial state and they just sort of like branch off, something like this. Okay. So I want to run the following argument by you. So imagine that we thought that they all shared an initial state, okay, and then they just kind of like branched off as the vagaries of life passed by. You might say something like, "Well, is it chancy, which initial state that God chose, right? So there are a number of initial states that he could have chosen, right? Well, is it chancy that he chose that initial state rather than another initial state? If it's chancy, then it seems like maybe it's a brute fact, right? Or it's like a brute contingency that he chose one initial point rather than another initial point. And then, well, let's say it's not chancy. Okay. Then it's going to be necessity. And what I want to say here, just like bracketing, and then I'm going to go to the other branch of the tree, is that, look, we have brute fact and we have necessity. But what are the options on naturalism, right? As to why the universe exists. We have brute fact and we have necessity, right? You could go with some like Russell view or maybe some Amy Kurofsky necessitarianism. So it seems like naturalism is going to be simpler. The second option is it's not the case that every possible world shares an initial state. And you can imagine that, like, I don't know, maybe like God's psychology, like, you have the Lewisian view, like all the possible worlds just like, I don't know, exist at the same time. Well, is it chancy which one God chooses? And again, we run the same argument, right? Like if it's chancy which world God chooses, then it's going to be brute fact. If it's not chancy, then it's going to be necessity. And then I'm just going to run some theory choice argument, and I'm going to say that naturalism is the simpler view. So I suppose what I'm asking is, why not think that even after all of this, right? After all of this, the question is, what theory, is going to be simpler? And we have to ask, did God choose the unsurpassable world in a chancy or non-chancy way? And we're just left with the same options that the naturalist has, right? Which is, it's either going to be some kind of brute fact or it's going to be some kind of necessity. It depends on what flavor of argument you like and what intuitions you have. And so at the end of the day, naturalism is just going to win because they have the same options. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so. So first on the question, do I think that all possible worlds share an initial state? I guess my view is that no, if we're talking about an initial state of the universe, which is often how Oppie seems to be talking when he expresses that idea.
Yeah.
Because no, I think like the universe, if God exists, then God created the universe in a different initial state, and if God doesn't exist, the universe could have been in a different initial state. Like the values of, even if the laws of physics are necessary, which I doubt, then like the constants could have, there could have been a different amount of entropy at the initial condition of the universe, etc. So no, I don't think so. If it's the universe, if we're thinking of like the initial state as God, then maybe in that you've got like God having essential properties, and then he makes his first free choice, and then that's the thing that's contingent. That might be right. But I think that the other part of your question can really, as you may have suggested, can be asked independently, because you suggest it comes up on either whatever you say here. And this is Oppie's objection to I think he presents as an objection to like cosmological arguments, that the initial state of the universe is either a brute fact that it is what it is, or it's necessary that it is what it is. If it's but you have those same options on naturalism and on theism, and naturalism is simpler, and so we should prefer naturalism. I think this just is the wrong model of theory choice. I think you should be thinking about it in terms of probabilities. So you want to ask, conditional on theism and conditional on naturalism, what's the probability that the universe would have the initial state it does? And for the simplicity, I think you can like inherently or in some way apply probabilities to necessary propositions, but for simplicity, ignore that. Let's just take the brute fact, horn of the dilemma, and then say that it's a brute fact that God creates one of the unsurpassable universes rather than another, and it's a brute fact on naturalism that the universe, kind of mixing here, because we're talking about whole universes, whole worlds versus initial states, but a brute fact on naturalism that the universe that as a whole, the shape it does. So brute fact in either case, but not that I think it's necessarily going to be just a matter of like being indifferent among all of the possibilities, but there are going to be fewer possibilities on theism because there's lots of worlds that are ruled out, right? And on naturalism, there are going to be a lot more possibilities. And so one kind of, this is too simplistic an argument. I would want to make this more careful, but one kind of way to see, okay, it's not just going to be like these aren't just going to be on a par. Say for simplicity, so imagine there are like 10 possibilities on theism, and there's like a million possibilities on naturalism, and so then theism is going to be better because there's going to be a 1 in 10 probability of this universe as opposed to a 1 in a million probability on naturalism. Okay, it's going to be a lot more complex to actually assign plausible probabilities. We don't want to assign equal probabilities across all different possible universes. I think we should be like start with the initial state and then think about how things evolve. But that's like the shape of why I think that kind of simplistic objection from Oppie doesn't work.
Okay, perfect. I have one follow-up, and this is like actually very relevant to the research that I'm doing. Then we'll go immediately to Klaus. We started a little bit late. So I totally take your point, and it's exactly what I anticipated you would say. So what I'm worried about here, a worry that Plantinga had, I'm putting a quote in the chat because I'm obsessed with quotes, is where he kind of gives this divine psychology objection to what a lot of the fine-tuning people say, right? Where he's going to say, look, God's transcendent, his ways are not our ways, his purposes are inscrutable. Can we really say how probable it is that God would create this, or he would create that, or he'd fine-tune the universe? And you have a great objection against skeptical theism. I think the best one in the literature, actually. And so what I'm wondering is that if we say, like, look, like, this is just probability raising on theism, I'm wondering if the probability raising on theism hinges crucially on, like, well, this is just what God would do. Like, this is what he would intend. This is what he would want. This is what he would hope. And we happen to see these things. And so what we're doing now is invoking divine psychology in a way that may be illicit. Now, maybe you can say, look, no, we could do it in these kinds of cases. But my worry is that once you invoke the divine psychology, the problem of evil is just going to come back, right? Because then people are going to say, well, like, look, I can employ divine psychology to run the problem of evil, and now we have this kind of stalemate. And I know that I'm a little bit nervous asking the question, if I'm totally honest with you, because you're the guy on this topic. But yeah, so I'm wondering what you thought about that. Hopefully that's a germane question, but yeah.
Yeah, well, so first I'm going to ask you to send me that quote from Plantinga because I don't think I've seen it before, but it's relevant to my interests. But it's interesting to me. So I, as you might know, and as some others here probably know, I have another paper. If we can't tell whether if we can't tell, what is it? If we can't predict, if theism, I'd have to look it up. It's like the skeptical theism implies agnosticism is the is the thesis of the paper. So it's that if we can't predict whether God would allow evil, then we can't tell whether theism is true. Is the basic idea, and the critique is of the skeptical theist claim that we should be that we have no idea what the probability of evil given theism is, and what the quote from Plantinga is stating a very similar idea about fine tuning. That both of these they think involve too much confidence in divine psychology, and in being able to discern God's reasons. And I am much more willing to assign probabilities here than Plantinga and many skeptical theists. Plantinga is not totally hostile to probabilities. He's happy to assign them in some theistic context elsewhere. So I'd like to read where he says that some more to try to understand what he's getting at. But one worry that people have expressed for that skeptical theist line is, oh, it would undermine natural theology. And for the most part, a lot of skeptical theists are just happy to say, fine, I don't like natural theology. I'm a reformed epistemologist, whatever. And so that in my paper, I say actually it undermines rational belief in theism more directly, because it means that if you are agnostic about the probability of some evidence given theism, where you think it could be anything from 0 to 1, then you should think the probability of theism given that evidence could be anything from 0 to near 1. The precise value of that latter term is going to depend on some other details of the probabilities you assign. And so you should be agnostic about theism too. And I think you're going to have that same problem with the kind of line that Climenhaga is pushing about fine-tuning here. So I don't think Climenhaga should say that if he's a theist. But so more substantively, like what's wrong with the line of argument, I think that, a couple of things. So you shouldn't take probabilities, but probabilities are partly an expression of ignorance. And so they're not, so there's at least a sense in which you're being less committal than if you were to say God would do exactly this. They're compatible with quite a bit of uncertainty about divine psychology. So, we're kind of talking as if we know, like, well, here are the, the unsurpassable worlds, and then God's going to be indifferent between those or something like that. And yeah, maybe God would be, for simplicity, let's assume God would be indifferent among the unsurpassable worlds. I think something that probably can't be exactly right, because there's, like an uncountable number of them. And I'm not sure, I don't think, especially with the kind of what I said about God's free choices, I don't think the way God makes choices by like creating a whole world at once. I think he probably does like something that's more like piecemeal, like creating an initial state of the universe and then intervening and so on and creating new universes. So it's more complicated than that. But suppose for simplicity that, God is indifferent among all the possible worlds that are unsurpassable. Okay. But then we might not know what those are. We might be uncertain about what the best possible worlds are. And so then maybe we have different theories about what those could be. And then like each theory has a probability, and conditional on that theory, then we have a probability for God creating any given one among those. And so that's kind of the way that you would get to the probability relative to our evidence that God would create any particular world by like averaging over the different possibilities of divine psychology. So that's kind of the way that I would suggest that we should proceed here. And then there's kind of the second thing to say is that there's kind of a reductio of this thought that like we should just be that we just can't say anything about the probability that God would act one way rather than another, and that's like, look, you could imagine, like, even if you don't think that the going theistic arguments are persuasive, you can imagine like really, really good evidence. Like you can imagine, this is a standard thing people say to objections to fine tuning. You look up in the sky and you see the stars in the sky rearranged to form the words of the Nicene Creed in Koine Greek. Like, you pray for a sign and then you see this. Okay, well, that's very good evidence for theism, right? You should be confident. Like the probability of theism given that evidence is high. Okay, but the kind of line that Climenhaga is pushing is going to lead you to say, like, well, divine psychology, who can say, right? And so the probability of that, I don't know what it is, right? And so then you're going to have to say, like, no, in that case, I don't know what the probability of theism is. Maybe it's high, maybe it's low, who knows? Okay, well, I think that's a reductio. Obviously, in that case, the probability of theism is high. So you need a theory of probability that is going to allow you to say that.
Steve, the last question, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you guys for all staying. And Nevin, thank you for your time.
So my question has to do with your idea that he creates things as he goes along. I think this is that this entails that there's an infinite sequence of better universes. Because look, let's assume that the A series is true and that presentism is true, and let's assume that it's better for an individual to live longer than shorter. So if he creates, let's say Dan, if he creates Dan like now rather than creating him a million years ago, then Dan loses out on a million years of happiness. And so it's subpar for him to create things later rather than earlier, but he could create things like infinitely far back. So now you might say, well, look, so long as Dan hits infinity, what difference does it make? But I mean, if you think there's a cap on infinity, then you're already playing a different game than like you and Rubio haven't played to begin with. So I'm not sure, why doesn't the creation as you go along necessarily entail that there's no unsurpassable world?
Yeah, so I think two things. So first, well, I don't think you can go infinitely far back, because I think there has to be a first cause. And we can get into arguments for that, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. But I don't think that creating somebody now versus a million years from now, and then like their life proceeding the same way, that the first world is better in which that person is created now, because I think you're not creating more value, you're just creating value faster. And the reason for this in the formal procedure, I think that this doesn't work in Rubio's procedure because I think times are not locations. Times are not the loci of value. Person's lives are the loci of value. Maybe experiences, for set aside the worries about that. Like, let's just, even if we assume experiences are, but experience is individuated in such a way that it's not like that you can have the same experience at different times, like now or a million years from now, like just purely phenomenological experiences, say. So I don't think that creating somebody a million years earlier, but their life proceeding in the same way, that the world in which they're created earlier is a better world. Because I think you should be summing over lives or over experiences and not over times.
Right, but if you think that something exemplifies a property at a time, there's no time at which Dan would be as well off exemplified now as he would be a million years ago, assuming the experiences are the same. Now you might say, well, I'm taking an internalist or a B series perspective. Okay, well, number one, that's a very strong preference. It's not clear that's true with the kind of the sort of free will approach that theists tend to adopt. Number one, but no, and we should signal it. Number two, but number three, that seems to involve sort of a totalist approach. We just total it out, and if we could total it out, we could have skipped this whole discussion and just say, look, there's a maximum infinity, and that's true for Dan's life no matter when you create it. So I guess one, it's a really strong preference to block it in crying internalism plus B series. Number two, it should be signaled. And number three, it seems to presuppose that there's just a maximum first order infinity. If not, and if we knew that, we could have bypassed a lot of the discussion.
Yeah, so it's not totaling it out. It's not like holism about the world, about the whole world. It's maybe holism about people's lives. But even that, I suggested you don't necessarily need. Maybe you could go with experiences rather than times. And so it's just denying that times are locations specifically. And so let me give. I'm looking up my first paper here. This thought experiment is not from me, but I give it in a footnote from Kane. Okay, so compare two worlds. So this is an example that he gives to argue that times are not locations. That I think it's plausible. So okay, world one, you're in an infinite universe with infinitely many persons. You are. See. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is his first example. I only give the one example, but you're making a choice between two possibilities here. Okay, so you're in an infinite universe with infinitely many persons, but here are the two possibilities. You can either be in a continually expanding sphere inside of which everyone is happy and everyone outside the sphere is unhappy, or a continually expanding sphere inside of which everyone is unhappy and inside of which everyone is happy. At any moment in time, there is infinite utility in the second scenario and infinite disutility in the first, right? Does that make sense? But any person in the world will enjoy, over all of time, infinite utility in the first scenario and infinite disutility in the second. And it seems reasonable that if you were a person in that scenario, you would want to be in the first scenario and not in the second. So that's an argument that we shouldn't think of times as locations, because if we were summing over times, we would prefer the second scenario. But of course, we should prefer the first scenario.
But just real quick, I mean, I didn't say that the location of times. I just said that that objects exemplify properties at a time. I think the person is the exemplifier, and it just seems to be a look. It's unless you think there's like olive knot, unless you assume B series and eternalism, it's just the case that it's better to have a million years more happiness than it's not, and to get around that, again, not do you need those odd views of time and existence, but you also need to have that Aleph knot maxes out infinity, which I think is inconsistent with both your and Rubio's assumptions.
Yeah, I think you do need the times or locations to make your argument work. So I mean, it would be like, otherwise it's like saying, oh well, you here you have this great life in Canada, and then in this other one you have this great life in the US. and like phenomenologically they're identical. But look, the first one was in Canada, so you should prefer that one. Well, what? Like that's what it sounds to me like when you say, well, the first one is like it starts earlier. Like, look, they're the same lives in the two worlds. The experiences are the same. So why are you saying the first one is better? Well, it starts earlier. Okay, well, it's in Canada rather than the U.S. The response, the objection sounds to me like that. If you grant that times are not locations, and that locations, that what we're summing over values over are instead experiences or lives as a whole.
One quick response, then I absolutely stop. But no, just because times are relevant doesn't mean that the time is location. If I say here's two versions of what makes someone's life go better, your total utility and your utility per moment. The fact that, let's say we think the second one's better. The fact that we think it's utility per moment doesn't mean it's time-based. It's still person-based. It's just a way of measuring a person's well-being. Similarly,
It's in a person's life or moments in like objective time. So because if it's in a person's life, then yeah, that's fine. But if it's in like external time, then that's where I'm saying no, that's assuming the time is locations, the times are locations.
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, that was really informative and genuinely, I think, an electric conversation, not just because we're online and we're using the internet. So I really appreciate you spending the time to speak with us. I had to do the joke. It was obligatory, morally speaking. So yeah, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. I'll send you that citation for Plantinga just because you said you were curious. Yeah, and hopefully we cross paths soon again. You're a fantastic philosopher and the paper was fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for a great conversation. This was really fun.